Good morning, everyone. I realize people are still trickling in, but we can go ahead and get started on the event. My name is Professor Benjamin Hopkins. I'm the Sigur Center Director, and it's my great privilege to welcome you all this morning here in Washington, D.C., or wherever you might be in the world. This is part of our ongoing webinar roundtable series on Taiwan. And today's topic, I think, is one of particular interest and timeliness, and that is cross-strait relations in pandemic times. I think we're all aware of both the opportunities and as well the potential pitfalls of cross-strait relations these days, especially with a really dynamic political situation both in Taiwan, China, as well as the United States. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers today, including Elbridge Colby and Shelley Rigger, who very kindly joined us from opposite corners of the world. And so we're in for a real treat in a discussion. Just a couple of quick ground rules to remind everyone of. This session is being recorded. We will try and put it up on YouTube in the following week or so for public access. If you have questions, and hopefully there will be many, please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A panel, which should appear on the right-hand side of your WebEx portal. We will be keeping our eyes on those and integrate them into the discussion as we go on. The other thing I'd like to remind everyone of is, as I mentioned, this is part of our ongoing roundtable series, and we have our next one coming up on December 9th, considering the post-election landscape for U.S. and Taiwan with the incoming Biden administration. So I think that'll be a nice complement to what we're talking today. And also we might be able to talk about some of the issues raised today as they evolve over the rest of the autumn and into the early winter. So with that said, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Deepa Ollapally, the Associate Director of the Sigur Center, who is going to moderate today's discussion. Over to you, Deepa.
It's so good to have so many people in attendance. We've got more than 100 attendees, and so we look forward to an invigorating discussion after the speakers are done. As Ben mentioned, stay tuned for December 9th. And of course, the elections have happened here, and so that I'm sure will be coming up in the talk as well as in discussions, at least in a preliminary way. So today, as everyone knows, the Chinese pressure in cross-strait relations on Taiwan during these times of pandemic, unprecedented time, has been ratcheting up rather than going down. But we also see China being more assertive elsewhere in the neighborhood, in the South China Sea, in Hong Kong, and on the Sino-Indian border. And so many observers are seeing this as a new phase, perhaps, of Chinese assertiveness in its foreign policy. And in this instance, Taiwan is a particularly important target for China's coercive actions, and this is in turn leading to heightened cross-strait tensions. And it raises many concerns, most importantly, about Taiwan's ability to defend itself and protect its democratic government, all against the very unsettled situation of the pandemic. So in this event, we're going to go sort of get a deep dive look into both the external challenges for Taiwan in this regard, as well as how Taiwan itself is approaching this question, how its attitudes are evolving. So I have asked, I've sort of divided up the topic in the external-internal fashion, and that's how the panelists will be taking it up. Of course, there'll be overlap as well. So now I have the great pleasure of introducing our two speakers, both of whom are highly reputed experts that really need no introduction to this audience, but they deserve one. So let me give them a brief one. Now, after I introduce them, they're each going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then I will return to the discussion and open up Q&A as well as part of the program. So our first speaker will be Elbridge Colby. He is who I've been trying to get, and finally it's such a great thing that we could make it. I know you're in Brazil or situated right now, but thank you for joining us, Bridge. He is the co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a new initiative that sounds very exciting. It's focused on developing strategies for the United States in a new era of great power competition. Just before this, he was the director of the defense program at CNAS right here in Washington. And he also served in the government as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. And at DOD, I want to point out that he was the lead official in developing the 2018 National Defense Strategy. This is a preeminent document for U.S. security policy. So anything goes wrong, Bridge, it comes back to you. His work has appeared in top outlets like the Foreign Affairs, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and he's also publishing away frequently on policy. He's also testified before Congress and appeared before the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission. So he's been very active on policy issues, as you can see. He also holds a law degree from Yale University. Shelly Rigger, who will follow Bridge, is the Brown Professor of Political Science at Davidson College in North Carolina. And Shelly has appeared with us several times before, and I'm so happy to have you return, Shelly. Thank you for joining us today. She is, of course, one of the world's leading scholars on the politics of Taiwan and China. She's the author of several books, including the most important one, Why Taiwan Matters, Small Island Global Powerhouse. This is, I think, a must-read for anyone interested in Taiwan. She's a prolific writer, and her other books on Taiwan's domestic politics include Politics in Taiwan, Voting for Democracy, as well as From Opposition to Power, Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party. And we know how dynamic the politics are in Taiwan. Currently, Shelley's research studies the effects of cross-strait economic interactions on the attitudes of Taiwan's population toward China. Beyond her academic accomplishments, she too has testified before Congress multiple times, and she also is involved in training military officers as well. And Shelley holds a PhD from Harvard. And I want to add one more thing about Shelley, that she is perfect for this panel because she is one of the few people who actually spent part of the pandemic in Taiwan. She was there on a Fulbright Cross-Strait Relations Fellowship, and she kind of almost got stuck, but I guess she was managed to come back in March, and I'm glad she could do that and join us today. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Bridge, who will take us on a tour of the external challenges and what U.S. should be worried about and concerned about as well. Thank you both.
Great. Well, thanks, Deepa, for the kind introduction, and thanks to Ben and the Sigur Center for the invitation. It's a pleasure to appear with Shelly Rigger and Deepa. I wasn't ignoring you. It's a delight to be, or sort of try to escape. It's a delight to be here. I'm glad we could finally make schedules align. So I know this is an important forum, and your work at the Sigur Center is one of the leading places doing work on Asia studies. So pleasure to be here. I was going to speak about where this sort of security and kind of military dimensions of cross-strait relations are, and give a little bit of a sense of where they're going to go, and then obviously, look forward to the discussion and the question and answers. I think that the bottom line, and those who have seen some of my work, will be familiar with my view on this, that the cross-strait military balance and the security threat to Taiwan, the military threat to Taiwan, is becoming increasingly grave. I mean, it already is grave, and it's only becoming more so. Obviously, as people like a number of people have pointed out, there's been tensions across the strait since the Chinese Civil War. But so what's changed in recent years? I mean, the fundamental reality is that the military balance has shifted dramatically As recently as the 2000s, even Taiwan on its own, but certainly the United States had a very confident ability to defend Taiwan against attack by the People's Republic. And that has shifted considerably. And if you track things like the China Military Power Report, as well as the views of outside experts, the growth and sophistication, the growth in scale and sophistication of the PLA cannot be underestimated. And that's, of course, the product of the fact that the PRC economy has matured enormously, grown in size and sophistication itself, and that obviously has a direct result in the capabilities of the PLA. I, for one, am not one of those. Some of my friends have this view, but I am not one of those who tends to discount the capabilities of the PLA because, for instance, they have not taken part in joint combat operations in the last couple of decades. I think they've made tremendous growth, and we would be very ill-served, and it would be imprudent to sort of discount the scale and capability of the PLA. And of course, while China's the growth of and maturation of China's military increasingly is relevant farther afield than Taiwan itself, Taiwan clearly remains the primary pacing scenario for the PLA, which is to say that first and foremost, both from the political statements of the Chinese leadership, but also if you look at its force structure and posture, resolving, in their words, the Taiwan issue remain the top priority for the PRC. And of course, this has resulted in tremendous progress from the point of view of the mainland. And I think, I'll touch on this a bit more, but China increasingly has a number of options to pursue ways of subordinating Taiwan and in the words of the mainland, reunifying Taiwan with the mainland. My own view is that an invasion scenario and a fait accompli is actually the most dangerous and increasingly probable. And I'm happy to talk about this a bit more. And that's because China's incentives, I think, are to avoid precipitating a very large conflict with the United States. And the best way to do that is to relatively quickly and cleanly subordinate Taiwan and essentially remove the variable of the views of the population on Taiwan. Essentially, not rely on coercion, but rely on a direct assault on the island. Because, and Shelley would know better than I, of course, but my impression is that no very, very small group of people on Taiwan are interested in unification with the PRC, certainly under the current context. China does have other options using both military and economic, as well as other tools of coercion, but these always have leave a significant amount of choice and discretion in the hands of the people on Taiwan. And I think, if anything, the U.S. experience the last half century or so, not only in economic sanctions, but also in the attempted use of bombing for coercion, indicates that it's difficult to make it work against a resolute victim, which is dealing with its own independence or fundamental autonomy. So I think this is the kind of, and if we look at the Chinese force development, this tracks. I mean, clearly they have, obviously, the very large missile force and air force that can be used from bombardment and so forth, but they're also developing the capacity for amphibious and air assault across the strait and the ability to sustain that, as well as the ability to block or deny American efforts to help Taiwan defend itself. So the military balance is increasingly negative and the situation is increasingly severe. At the same time, China under Xi Jinping has, I think it's fair to say, become increasingly assertive and willing to be confrontational. And Xi himself has indicated a number of times that he hopes to resolve the Taiwan issue. I think it's, others would know more about what specifically he's communicating, but I think there's reason to think that the Taiwan issue has become politically more of a focus, or resolving the Taiwan issue has become politically more of a focus, at least incrementally from Beijing's point of view. And then finally, I think China is actually has a broader strategic logic for making an example fundamentally of Taiwan. I think the pandemic, to Deepa's point about the sort of geopolitical consequence, the dynamic of the pandemic, I think, while it's too soon to say, one thing that does seem to be pretty clear from the pandemic is an intensification of balancing behavior. Now, that's not all due to the pandemic. I mean, I think the clashes along the line of actual control with India are only perhaps or somewhat related to the pandemic. But I think you see across Asia and increasingly in Europe more balancing behavior and sort of formation of a kind of a soft or informal coalition, the deepening of the Quad in the last meeting, for instance. And this, I think, China's interests are now changing. I think hide and bide is clearly dead. And I think very few people in Asia would believe hide and bide again, just as in the way that one country, two systems seems to be dead. And so while this is good news at one level, it also, China being an exceptionally powerful actor, has a range of options. I think this increases China's incentives to strike out in some way and short circuit the formation of this informal coalition. And I think Taiwan remains China's best option for that, because for a variety of reasons I'm happy to get into. But, you know, to use the cliche, Taiwan is a convenient chicken to signal to all the monkeys what the consequences of bucking China's will be. So anyway, the bottom line is that the situation is increasingly severe and it will only become more so. At the same time, the United States and Taiwan are doing better, but remain behind the curve simply because of the enormous scale of what China represents. I mean, for many years, there was a lot of lassitude, certainly on the part of the United States, and I think also on the part of Taiwan, to the increasing challenge posed by Beijing. This has now improved, and I think the 2018 National Defense Strategy, if I could be so bold, played a significant role on the U.S. side. And then this has increased in the last couple of years under the Trump administration. In some ways, it began under the Obama administration, but I think it's really gone to an entirely different level under the Trump administration. Things like the Indo-Pacific strategy and a more, I think, realistic sort of competitive approach towards China. And this is extended to Taiwan, where I think the Trump administration has walked I think, commendable line on Taiwan, signaling the strength and reality of the U.S. commitment and the willingness to take risk to help Taiwan defend itself, but also not going over some of these sort of totemic lines with Beijing in a way that would probably be counterproductive. And my impression is that the government on Taiwan has a similar view. At the same time, Taiwan, certainly in the last couple of years, has become more serious about its own defense. I think the promulgation of the overall defense concept and the increasing moves in that direction have been commendable. But for many years, Taiwan was behind the curve. So it's really a matter of catch up. I was encouraged by the Tsai administration's statement that it was going to increase defense spending to approach what South Korea spends, but we'll see. The proof will be in the pudding. But again, for many years, Taiwan has really lagged. So I think this is really a matter of catch up. And I think the bottom line here is that both the United States and Taiwan are going to have to sprint just to stay abreast of where China is going, if we're lucky. Now, Deepa asked about the arms sales. I think they fit into this pattern. I was not thrilled at the first round of arms sales that the Trump administration put through. I recognize there are bureaucratic politics in Taiwan and so forth, but I think there was a bit of disappointment there. But I think the more recent arms sales announcements have been encouraging. Here, it's vital that Taiwan allocate the resources and effort to actually go ahead and procure those systems like coastal defense cruise missiles, sea mines, air defense systems, cyber resilience, UAVs, these kinds of things that are actually making the ODC a reality. So going forward, what's the agenda for both the United States and Taiwan? I think from a defense planning point of view, the United States is going to need to increasingly focus on preparing to help Taiwan defend itself against a determined Chinese attack. This is going to be increasingly difficult, though, in light of the likely budget strictures that are going to emerge on the U.S. defense, the defense enterprise. So it's going to be a matter of hard choices. Taiwan's own actions are going to be critical, while, of course, the United States is essential to an effective defense of Taiwan in this day and age. I think the U.S. Decision to take the hard steps and spend the money and so forth and take the risk in the event of conflict to come to Taiwan's defense is going to be influenced, if not determined, by the sense of how serious Taiwan's own commitment to its own defense is. And I mean, I would say that the record so far has been anemic. I give a lot of credit to the Tsai administration on this point for changing the narrative. So I don't want to be too tough, but I do think it should not be taken for granted. It's very important that Taiwan take steps to meaningfully realize the ODC and spend adequate amounts, at least what South Korea spends, which is far less threatened than Taiwan is. I think in terms of thinking about what that defense posture and strategy is going to look like, as I mentioned, I think for China, the best strategy is the fait accompli, an invasion that would relatively quickly and cleanly try to subordinate Taiwan. And I use clean from Beijing's perspective, obviously not the people on Taiwan. In this context, I think our goal should be denial. So together, the United States and Taiwan, and I was encouraged to see that there might be more cooperation between the two sides and training and so forth. But that the two sides could either deny the PLA's ability to seize territory of Taiwan, and I'm talking about the core territory, the main island of Taiwan, or hold it. And this is probably a reality of how powerful the PLA is going to be, that it may be, while the United States and Taiwan should seek to deny the ability of Chinese forces to land on Taiwan in the first place, that may be untenable, or it may not be possible to do that to 100%. And so the other part of that will be to deny the PLA the ability to consolidate a hold on Taiwanese territory. So this is the preferred standard, but I do think the Chinese will have the option for a blockade or bombardment, probably coupled with economic coercion of some kind. In this case, Taiwan will really need to focus on increasing its resilience to such an attack or a coercion campaign, and this will, of course, be stockpiling key supplies, as well as diversifying its economic linkages so it's not so reliant on the mainland. I know that the Tsai administration look south policy and so forth, and discussions of the FTA with the United States, which seems to have some bipartisan support, are important steps in this direction. In terms of U.S. Political, I mean, I think Taiwan's position is relatively. I don't really have anything to say about Taiwan's own position. I think it seems pretty sensible given the lay of the land today. But for the U.S., I actually think the strategic clarity debate that has emerged over the last year or so has actually been pretty productive. I mean, I think the main thing is that Beijing recognized that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense in the event of an unprovoked attack. I mean, obviously, there's sort of a caveat for things like a declaration of independence by Taiwan, which would, of course, be inadvisable. But I think Beijing has to take away as a conclusion that there is broad support within the United States for coming to Taiwan's defense in the event of an aggressive assault against the island. And I think that in a sense is the goal. What exactly that ends up, formally being is sort of immaterial or secondary at least. But I think this debate has been productive. But I think from the perspective of people on Taiwan, should really take away many friends of Taiwan are again really concerned about the level of effort that the Taiwanese are putting into their own defense. I'm thinking a debate I had on Twitter with Bonnie Glaser, a highly respected China and Taiwan expert at CSIS, who was concerned about giving Taiwan too much of a blank check. And I think if Bonnie's thinking that way, it's probably fair to think that a lot of friends of Taiwan, I'd certainly count Bonnie in that category as far as I know, but that's a widespread view. So I think it's really important that Taiwan continue to move forward and strengthen its own defense and resilience in an era in which it will be increasingly at risk. Thanks.
Scenarios, and clearly, as you can see, the challenges for Taiwan are growing, and so that's something to keep our eyes on. And now I'm delighted to turn to Shelley, who is going to talk about it from the Taiwanese side, looking at drilling down a bit on Taiwan's political and social changes and how that might translate into impact on cross-strait relations. So, Shelley.
All right, well, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be with you, and I really look forward to this discussion. I enjoyed the first presentation a lot, and I hope I can add a little something as well. So first of all, I just want to talk about some of the really significant changes that are quite recent and of really high magnitude in some of the basic attitudinal indicators that we watch in Taiwan. So basically, how Taiwanese people view their own situation and their position relative to the PRC and so on. These basic attitudes have shifted dramatically in about the last 2 years. And all of these changes are in a direction that is unfavorable to Beijing's preferences and favorable to the preferences of the Democratic Progressive Party, the party of President Tsai, or DPP. Although there are some warning lights there for Tsai, most of them in the kind of "what have you done for me lately" genre. And they have given the KMT, the main opposition party, a little bit of opportunity to kind of tweak the Tsai administration. But at the moment, the Tsai administration is in a pretty strong position relative to public opinion. So what are some of these indicators that have changed dramatically, in my view? First of all, one of the things that we always look at when we're talking about Taiwan and trying to anticipate the trajectory of public opinion and therefore the trajectory of policy preferences in a democratic setting, one of the things we often look at is this category of national identity. So do you consider yourself Taiwanese, Chinese, or both Taiwanese and Chinese? And for the last 20 years, the percentage of people calling themselves Chinese has gradually, actually pretty rapidly dwindled down to almost none. But the percentage of people calling themselves both Taiwanese and Chinese has remained pretty high. For a long time, it was a plurality. For a long time, it was majority, then a plurality. Well, after being steady around about 40% for several years, the both category has fallen below 30%. And the Taiwanese only category is now at around almost 70%. And the increase from 60 to 70, a 10 percentage point increase, occurred in one single year. So that may be a blip, right? These patterns have been somewhat variable over time, but it looks as if there really is a kind of consolidation of the preference for a Taiwanese-only identity among a majority and perhaps a supermajority of the population. A sort of lagging indicator along those same lines is always the question of, do you support independence for Taiwan? A lot more people always say they're Taiwanese than are willing to say that they support independence. And in fact, support for independence is still well below majority. Support for independence immediately is very low, but support for maintaining the status quo for now and moving toward independence in the future has actually begun to increase. And at the moment, the support for status quo now, but move toward independence is equal to support for status quo now, decide later. So again, support for, at least in theory, sometime down the line, right, in the future, independence is also kind of creeping up. Finally, I would point out that the popularity of the DPP as a partisan preference has actually climbed above support for no affiliation or political independent for the first time. So historically, most Taiwanese have not affiliated with either party. Right now, more people say they affiliate with the DPP than say they have no partisan preference, but that's still only 33%. So that's the thing, is that these numbers, these sort of pro-DPP numbers, the kinds of things that the PRC looks at as bad news from their point of view, are creeping up, but they are still not, overwhelming. So for Taiwan and the DPP, there's still a lot of room to consolidate their victories. Speaking of consolidating Tsai's victories, right, all of these kind of public opinion trends were made concrete in January with a presidential and legislative result that was extremely positive for the DPP. It was not unmitigatedly positive for the DPP, but the DPP president was reelected and they retained their legislative majority. So overall, it was a very positive outcome for the DPP, and not one that was expected even a few months before the election. I arrived in Taiwan in early September 2019, and we were quite uncertain as to what the outcome of the election would be just a few months later in January. But as it turned out, it was a decisive victory for the DPP. So this candidate who had been pretty unpopular, this president who had a lot of sort of challenges with favorability ratings and so on coming into the election season, was reelected resoundingly. And it seems as if the shine is not wearing off. First of all, the DPP's COVID response, or Taiwan government's COVID response, gets very high ratings from everyone. They've come down a little bit since the height of the crisis in February, but her highest ratings for handling COVID are still very high. And I can talk more later about exactly what that was like to experience the onset of COVID in Taiwan. But definitely I'd give the Taiwan government high marks too. So also in terms of cross-strait management, Tai was underwater. So her disapproval of her cross-strait management outweighed approval throughout pretty much her entire first term in office until the last half year or so of her first term. But since then, her approval has exceeded disapproval, and at the moment, by a margin of 2-1. So people like how she's handling cross-strait relations. They like how she's handling COVID, which is the major domestic threat to Taiwan. Meanwhile, views of China or the PRC are very negative in Taiwan. A year ago, a Pew study found that only 35% of Taiwanese had a favorable view of the PRC. It's surely lower today. So why is public opinion changing in this way? I think there are two major reasons. One is that the positives for the PRC in Taiwan are less positive than they have been for a long time. So for many years, the economic opportunities and benefits that Taiwanese experienced in the mainland counterbalanced some of the more negative aspects of the relationship. But the PRC economy is becoming less friendly, welcoming, advantageous for Taiwanese, and I think we're beginning to see that in the public opinion polling. So the idea that, Taiwanese semiconductor suppliers should be replaced by made in China 2025 indigenous manufacturing, that narrative of we want to indigenize production in the PRC, i.e. get rid of all you foreigners, including Taiwanese, that sort of sunk into some Taiwanese investors. And then also the trade war with the US and other dimensions of global economic interactions have, I think, diminished the value of, or the perceived value of, the mainland as a place of economic opportunity for Taiwanese. So the positives are less positive. Meanwhile, the negatives are more negative, and they are starting to pile up. Probably the biggest negative over the past 2 years has been the crisis in Hong Kong, which is perceived in Taiwan as an example of how the PRC interferes where it can to undermine democracy and freedom. Like, whether or not that's really what is going on in Hong Kong, that's how it looks from Taiwan. So the degree of support for Hong Kong protesters is pretty high in Taiwan. A lot of Taiwanese are willing to allow Hong Kongers to come to Taiwan to seek refuge from what's going on in Hong Kong and so on. And so for a lot of Taiwanese, this is the proof that they've been waiting for, that, that Beijing can't be trusted. Another negative is COVID. The understanding of COVID in Taiwan is that whatever else countries like the US and European countries, countries around the world may have done wrong, COVID originated in mainland China, and the reason that Taiwan has, or one of the reasons Taiwan has done as well as it has, is precisely because they recognize that things that come from mainland China are dangerous, and they put up their defenses very quickly. So COVID is associated with its PRC, or its mainland China origins, and it is another negative. Another big negative is the military pressure that Bridge has already talked about. And people in Taiwan may not feel that as acutely as military planners in the US think they ought to, but they definitely know it's happening. And they see it as a sign of hostility from the PRC, and therefore it's a negative. And then finally, I would just point out that people in Taiwan know what it's like in Xi Jinping's China, and they are, generally speaking, pretty negative about that too. I spent my time from September through January of 2019-20 in Taiwan interviewing young people about how they think about mainland China. And compared to even 10 years ago, they're much more pessimistic and critical of the way things are in China. And they know a lot about it, and they don't like what they see. So this increasing negativity toward the PRC is coinciding with this heightened determination in Beijing to solve the Taiwan problem, or get Taiwan back, or whatever it is, that whatever particular characterization you want to give it. And this sounds like a contradiction from the outside. The more pressure, the more negative people in Taiwan are towards China, the more China wants to pull them closer. But of course, it's entirely predictable and understandable. The more pressure Beijing puts on, the more Taiwanese are pulling back and recoiling from this pressure. But from a policy standpoint, this contradiction is a real problem, because Beijing's desires and expectations are not altered by the evidence that it's not going to be easy to get what they want. So as Taiwanese become more unfavorable toward the PRC, the pressure just increases. And that, in turn, makes it more difficult for Taiwan to accommodate that pressure in any way. So in the past, Taiwanese governments have been able to kind of play at the margins, to cajole, to look for win-win opportunities with Beijing and so on. That is getting harder and harder, because as the PRC pressure increases and the Taiwanese popular resistance to that pressure increases, it squeezes Taiwan's officials in the middle. Meanwhile, that same dynamic is also affecting US-Taiwan relations. Taiwanese are more resistant to China. China is pushing harder on Taiwan. And so for a certain sector of the Taiwanese public, at least, there is the emerging question, all right, how do we get out of this? What's our escape route? And I would argue that the escape route that many people in Taiwan have invented for themselves in their minds is Donald Trump is going to save us. And there is this magical thinking about the Trump administration and Trump specifically, personally, as the window through which Taiwan is going to squeeze out of Beijing's grasp and somehow solve this problem without actually having to confront it. And that is why we saw so many people in Taiwan, 53% in one poll, supporting Trump's reelection. Similarly, when Mike Pompeo recently said, quote, Taiwan has not been a part of China, and implied that this is longstanding US policy, which clearly it is not, Tsai Ing-wen responded that she noticed this statement. She did not say she welcomed this statement. And for this, she was heavily criticized, mainly by people within her own party. So there's this other pressure on Tsai now, increasingly. Why are you not taking advantage of the opportunity that the US is giving us through the person of Donald Trump to solve this problem in a kind of perfect way. Meanwhile, my last point, Tsai herself is very prudent and smart. She insisted that Taiwan was not and should not take sides in the US election. She has congratulated President-elect Biden. She tweeted back his congratulations of her on her election to show that he does pay attention to Taiwan. He does care about Taiwan, which is something that that a lot of Taiwanese, especially in her party, don't believe. But she's swimming against the tide, especially within the DPP, and that can't be easy. So my last point is just that the longer this non-transition that we are experiencing in the US drags on, I think the harder Tsai Ing-wen's situation is going to be and the tighter the squeeze will become. Thank you.
Itself. And I'm going to give the audience a few minutes to continue to post questions for us. And in the meantime, I would like to take the opportunity to ask a couple of questions to the two of you. Let me just start with Shelley. Now, you spoke about we know that Taiwan's domestic politics is often extremely tumultuous and fast changing, but it seems as if, at least in the current period, there seems to be a trend towards some kind of a consensus. Do you see this as really an autonomous shift that does not necessarily have to do with the vagaries of cross-strait relations or U.S. and so forth, external? Rather, is there something internal that is driving this as well? So that's I'd like you to.
Sure. Yeah, that's a very interesting way to think about it. And I think that the consensus has existed for a long time, but what has prevented us from recognizing that consensus is the debate over how to carry out what it is that Taiwan needs. So the consensus has existed. I mean, Gunther Schubert published a paper about the consensus in Taiwan in 1999. So the consensus has been around for a long time. What do people in Taiwan want? They want what they've already got, right? They want this democratic status quo, autonomy from the PRC. It doesn't have to come with formal independence. And I actually think that is still the consensus, that it doesn't have to come with formal independence. It doesn't have to have a new flag and so on. Although we always have, there are always people in Taiwan who want the new flag and the formal trappings of independence. Where the appearance of a lack of consensus has come from in the past is this debate between the DPP and the KMT over how to achieve that. So for a long time, the KMT took the position that we can coexist with the Chinese Communist Party leadership as it is, that fundamentally what they want from us is that we keep open the possibility of the Chinese nation, the Chinese nation of the past, re-emerging in some form in the future, and we can kind of keep juggling their emotions for a long time, and that's the best way to handle it. Whereas for the DPP, the policy preference was, look, we need to harden ourselves because they will never accept our autonomy fully, and so we have to build our own walls higher. I think where we see a consensus emerging now is that with Xi Jinping in office, the KMT position is just no longer tenable. And even the KMT seems to be moving pretty quickly toward the conviction that Xi Jinping is not going to be cajoled or managed or handled in the way that previous generations of PRC leaders have been. And so Taiwan needs to figure something out. And so I think that is the sense in which you see consensus emerging.
Okay, and thank you. And of course, the Xi Jinping and Chinese assertiveness is, in fact, obviously a big factor in the shift. And I want to turn to Bridge on this. We see a pattern, a new phase in Xi Jinping's assertiveness overall, but you also point out that Taiwan is a special place in that context. And therefore, my question is, to what extent do you see, how can we extrapolate what's going on in Chinese foreign policy in general, and how can we extrapolate that to what's happening on cross-strait relations? Do you see those being connected? Do you see that that's part of a pattern? How do you see in the bigger geopolitical context that you are quite familiar with and analyze all the time?
Sure, and fascinating presentation by Shelley. So really interesting in a number of respects. I think that clearly, and others know much more about this than I, but clearly Xi Jinping and the sort of leadership he represents, and frankly, a broad swath of Chinese people, as far as we can tell, have just purely I don't want to say revanchist, kind of sort of a moralizing way of put it, but want to have sort of nationalist, patriotic reasons to unify with Taiwan. So I don't want to discount, and the reality of that factor is part of what makes, paradoxically somewhat, is part of what makes Taiwan a very attractive target for China. My point is that Taiwan also makes sense in the context of China's broader aims, and I think it's become very clear in the last couple of years that China does have such broader aims. I tend to focus a lot on China's sort of medium-term goal being a hegemonic position in Asia. I sometimes get in debates to people about how global are China's ambitions, and sometimes it's sort of a semantic debate. But I think China's sort of proximate's not the word, sort of medium-term goal is to establish a dominant position over its region, which is also the world's largest market. It's over 50% of global GDP. And I think China's behavior in the last few years, not least with India, as you mentioned, is consistent with a country that is not simply interested in unifying with Taiwan, but is rather trying to seek a dominant position in the region. China's behavior vis-a-vis Australia just in the last couple of weeks over the investigation of the pandemic, and of course, the litany of examples is, as long as the Bible or whatever. There are plenty of examples. I think China's challenge, frankly, when I look at it, is if I were in Beijing and that were my goal, I think China has to have a way to. China's more assertive and aggressive behavior is precipitating coalition formation. To your point, Deepa, about India, India, of course, has enormously deep, tremendously deep roots in the non-aligned, kind of approach, and a very nationalist approach, and frankly, kind of anti-American approach. There's also a lot of friction in the transatlantic relationship, and frankly, China's aggressive and assertive behavior is essentially overcoming that. I think the Europeans have moved significantly on China in the last kind of year or two, and so China has to, I think, add. It has money, it has BRI and things like that, which are of use, but I think they're of limited utility when you're dealing with really capable states and large states like India and Japan and South Korea and so forth. And then it has these coercive instruments, obviously military, but also economic and so forth. But I think what we have now is we have a sort of coalition formation, and China needs to add a more clear deterrent to sort of short circuit or stop or hobble that formation and kind of cohesion of that coalition. And Taiwan, in my view, is a perfect instance of that, because obviously it's nearby, China shaped its military and so forth, but also because it is wrapped up in an internal Chinese narrative. So it actually, if China invaded Vietnam, it would be clearly seen as crossing international borders, an illegitimate attack. A Chinese attempt to subordinate Taiwan, I think, would be a more complicated affair. And that makes China, it makes it more attractive for China because it would be more uncertain. Now, things fortunately seem to be changing. I'm not saying I agree with that, but it would be a tougher position for defenders of Taiwan to take, which is one of the reasons I think it's important to focus on it. But I think that's an extra reason for Taiwan, and I'm not sure that people on Taiwan always appreciate this, is that actually Taiwan plays a very natural next step in China's broader regional goals. It's not simply a sort of nationalist emotional thing about finishing the Civil War.
Okay, thank you so much for charting that out so clearly for us. Now, I do want to turn to the audience questions. Thanks for your patience, everybody. I'm going to, as I said, there are quite a few media people here as well. And one of the first ones I'm going to turn to is from someone you may know, Bridge and Shelley, Tina Chung of Voice of America. And she's actually bringing up a point that Shelley noted about Secretary Pompeo's quote and about Taiwan not being part of China ever. And so her question is, could the panel, so it's related, addressed to both of you, shed some light on why Pompeo would make the statement, since the U.S. has not said anything related to Taiwan's sovereignty as such so clearly before. And in fact, earlier, Secretary Stilwell said that U.S. doesn't take a position on these things. So the question is, will this comment have positive or negative significance for Biden administration? You know, how is this going to affect Biden's management of future cross-strait relations? And how do you see that? I mean, the Biden administration's balancing a close U.S.-Taiwan relationship without a conflict with China. And so, you know, we knew that some questions on the Biden administration is going to come up. So let's just get to that first right away. Shelley, you want to?
Sure. You know, this Pompeo comment was very kind of, I don't know if it was off the cuff, if that's the right way to describe it, but it was hard to understand what he really meant by it, and to what extent he was making a carefully considered policy statement as opposed to answering a question without necessarily considering all the possible implications of the answer, put her that way. Mm-hmm. There's no question that this makes things much more difficult for whoever comes next, because the Beijing will use it as a weapon against the U.S. You know, you changed your policy on us without any warning, you know, if they want to. If they don't want to, they won't use it. But if they do want to, they will use it. And they'll use it against Biden just as well as they'd use it against Trump. You know, this is the Secretary of State saying that the U.S. has a policy that the U.S. doesn't have, or changing our policy on the fly to say that the U.S. does not believe that Taiwan is part of China, which is, as everybody on this call knows, not U.S. policy. So the PRC this is a little coin in their pocket now, another thing to use against the U.S. It also makes things harder for Taiwan, because for the Biden administration to return to U.S. policy going back to 1972 now feels like he's changing things in a negative direction, right? So that many people in Taiwan, by no means all people, but a significant number of people, are primed to dislike Biden as it is. There's been a huge anti-Biden campaign in the deep green media in Taiwan. You know, it's pretty shocking, really, some of the things that have happened related to the U.S. election in Taiwan. So that people are primed to believe that Biden is anti-Taiwan to begin with, and now he has to reaffirm a policy which has been the U.S. policy across all administrations, Democratic and Republican, since the early 1970s, but it's going to look like he's taking back something that Mike Pompeo gave Taiwan in the waning hours of the Trump administration. So I think it is a really, really very unfortunate thing for Pompeo to have done. And it puts also Tsai Ing-wen in a very difficult position because, again, she can't embrace this. She knows this is not real. The U.S. is not actually changing its policy in this way. But she also can't reject it because she cannot be perceived either domestically or by the U.S., because this administration is still here, as in any way challenging the U.S.
Rich, can you add anything on that?
Yeah, I have a different view on this one. I mean, I was actually scrambling just to look it up because I think Shelley knows this a lot better than I. But I mean, my understanding is that the U.S. position is that the U.S. doesn't take a position on who has sovereignty over Taiwan. That our position in the communiques and so forth, and the Six Assurances and so forth, is that we acknowledge that both Chinese on both sides of the strait, yada yada, viewed one China and so forth, but we don't actually take a position. So I mean, I don't know what Secretary Pompeo what his particular intent was, but my guess is that he was trying to push back on a sort of a narrative that obviously with Chinese PRC being increasingly influential, that it is taken as a given that we accept the Chinese position. And I mean, of course, saying that I mean, obviously, the island of Taiwan was part of the Republic of China from 1945 to 1949, and of course, under the Qing, there was, it was, China had some degree of control. Though my understanding is that that's somewhat disputed. But I mean, I think. I don't see that as a fundamental shift, but rather probably pushing back on a narrative that we're going to kind of accede to China's clarification of the issue. I mean, I don't know what the implications are on Taiwan. Shelley would be much better off or much better prepared and knowledgeable to comment on that. I would say that, I mean, I think given from an American perspective, given that Taiwan is likely to be the flashpoint in the world, frankly, above all, because it's the major natural flashpoint between the United States and China, and of course, Taiwan and China, not that the U.S. is imposing itself on Taiwan. It is important that there be a clear, well, clear is probably not the right word, but a compelling position explained to the American people. And I think Secretary Pompeo said on the Hugh Hewitt show, she's speaking to a mass audience, and that people understand why they're potentially going to be taking so much risk for the potential defense of Taiwan if it comes to that. So, I mean, I think that, as I said before, I think the Trump administration has really walked the line on Taiwan quite well. And I mean, I think there's broader support for Taiwan's autonomy, not obviously declaration of independence, but Taiwan's continuation of the status quo and assistance in its defense against China, both from a military coercion to some extent, although that's really the United States, the primary reliant there, but also in the economic and other spheres.
All right. Well, as we know, words do matter, especially when uttered by top diplomats, and we assume that they take that into account when they say certain things. But all right, thank you. We'll have. Let me just turn to a few other questions that are coming in. This one is a question from Ryan Loomis, and it's a question for Bridge and for me, apparently, as well. Anyway, Ryan asked the question, how does the current Taiwan political leadership view great power competition, especially as it kind of plays out in the area around Taiwan? So the great power competition around, such as U.S. Navy transit in the Taiwan Strait, U.S. aircraft entering the Taiwan's ADIZ, air defense and identification zone and so forth. How does the Taiwan administration, how does the Tsai administration generally view, I suppose, the great power competition that's kind of unfolding that, Bridge, you've been talking about, that I've been thinking about as well? So you
Sure. I mean, Shelley would probably be better off to explain what the Thai government. I mean, in my limited encounters with them, I think they seem to have a pretty solid understanding, at least at the senior political level of their situation. I mean, I think the issue for Taiwan is that if it were located where New Zealand is, it could happily sort of ignore a lot of these issues. But unfortunately, given its location and ties, it's just a very sort of present and pressing reality for Taiwan. So, I mean, great power competition, I think in a sense, Taiwan's perspective is pretty narrow, but at the sort of the front line, literally, where, I mean, obviously, Taiwan left to its own devices would essentially have no hope. So, its only prospect is in, as I think people on Taiwan understand, is in some sort of a collaboration with the United States, which just invariably means it's part of this broader great power dynamics, which is I think how the United States is fundamentally going to look at the Taiwan issue. But I mean, I think again, I mean, in terms of their domestic politics, I'm not really qualified, or it's really not my place to say, but I think the Tsai government, as far as I can tell, and Foreign Minister Wu, they've been handling the issues that pretty soberly and sagely. Unlike some of the previous Taiwan governments, I don't think there's a sense in the United States that they're irresponsible or, dramatically unpredictable or something. I think it feels like a strong hand on the rudder that's pretty prudent. I mean, I don't want to go overboard, but I mean, I think it's they seem to get where they fit into this broader context. And I mean, I think that's probably a critical piece to bear in mind, of course, for Taiwan, which is of course used to this, but is that this is ultimately a potential conflict between great powers. And so the stakes are far, far greater than about just Taiwan itself. And so I think, and again, I think I commend the Tsai government for this, but I mean, I think understanding that their own particular issues, for instance, within the DPP that Shelley was talking about, have to be contextualized within this broader great power dynamic that's going to be kind of controlling.
Shelley, I think this question could use your insight on the administration.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing that strikes me is that if we are conceptualize Taiwan's predicament as the tip of the spear in great power competition, then I think Taiwan's in real trouble, right? The position that Taiwanese have always taken is that they cannot change their location and that they need to engage the mainland in a lot of ways. They need to engage the mainland economically, they need to engage the mainland in people-to-people interactions, that they ideally will be able to have some quasi, semi, or actually official interactions to manage the relationship. The idea that Taiwan would be set up as the outer perimeter fence, a confrontation between the US and China. I don't see how Taiwan manages to retain its security and democracy and prosperity in that scenario. So I'm inclined to say that we ought to look for ways to dial back this great power confrontation. I mean, if we actually care about Taiwan's long-term survival as a free society, then rushing into the great power confrontation with Taiwan as the tip of the spear, I think that's really problematic. And, I am not the military expert on the panel, but I would just caution the listeners to think about the implications for Taiwan of occupying that position in US-China relations, and to continue to imagine and try to make real alternatives to that kind of scenario.
Could I just comment on this, Deepa?
Yes.
Because I think this is important. I mean, I think it's Shelley's comments have sharpened the issue. I mean, the alternative to Taiwan, realistically, is Hong Kong, which is essentially, which, you know, many people in the West and other parts of Asia deeply sympathetic to Hong Kong. I mean, I actually grew up there for part of my youth and stuff, but it's indefensible. It's outside of the perimeter, and China's level of resolve is higher. It's willing to do what's necessary to put it under its thumb. And that's the reality. So, you know, Taiwan is just simply in an exceptionally difficult situation. And if it's not inside of the U.S. defense perimeter, broadly construed, and what the political nature of that relationship is I think more subject to sort of discussion, amendment, and so forth. But you know, if Taiwan tries to hew a kind of a middle course, I mean, I think it has to be responsible. But if it tries to sort of avoid it and not do the things that are necessary to defend itself within the context of the U.S. defense perimeter, it risks the U.S. essentially deciding what we considered in the 1940s, 1950s of cutting it loose, and then Taiwan, essentially, the Chinese would have a free hand, and I think people on Taiwan understand that. That's what they see what's happening in Hong Kong, and so, you know, I mean, again, it's a really, really tough situation, but I think we need to be very clear-eyed about it and take the necessary steps. And it's better to take the hard steps now before a crisis, so that we shape decisions and expectations, rather than defer it until later when a crisis might already emerge.
Well, this is clearly a tricky position for both Taiwan and for the U.S. But I want to just add something that is taking a step back and on great power competition itself. It seems to me that as the great power competition, if we see it as tightening in the near future, then the question is, you know, is that closing certain options for China as well? Because really what's happening that I see is that the formation of coalitions that are becoming more adversarial to China. And therefore, it suddenly is no longer its core interest, Taiwan being the place where they can focus, but now they're going to have to dissipate their energies and attention many more places than they earlier had. So I think that that there's a possibility, at least, that that given the kind of unfavorable great power competition that could emerge for China, that they may have to walk a little bit more carefully in its immediate neighborhood. Now, I could be totally wrong, but this is just one alternative way of thinking about it. So that's with that. I wish we could spend a whole session on this, I think. All right, so with that, let me turn to something and some other questions, which, by the way, actually are related to this question that was just raised. And this is a question by John Tai, who's a lecturer at the Elliott School. And he wants to know about some of the more domestic attitudes on defense, but U.S. in this case. So both of you can perhaps take a crack at this one. He says that there's consensus in Taiwan that reunification, as Shelley mentioned, with the mainland is really not an option. He wants to know whether there is a greater willingness among Taiwan residents to take up arms to defend Taiwan, meaning how much of this translates into a harder military stand. And a related question from Ryan Loomis is the thinking of leaders in the military, business, and political parties, and how that sort of shakes out on these questions as well. So I guess this question really, Shelley, it's yours.
So the problem or the concern about Taiwan's so-called will to fight, right, has been a big one for a very long time. It's ironic because, you know, modern Taiwan has its roots in basically a military state. It was ultra militarized through the 1950s and 60s. But today, there is plenty of evidence to suggest that Taiwanese are not, one, particularly motivated by the military threat to take actions in their own lives that would, be aimed at addressing it. And two, they don't seem particularly worried about it, actually. And I think this is something that absolutely mystifies almost everyone in the U.S. and certainly in U.S. Military circles, is how come Taiwanese people are not more scared? And I think one reason is that they've lived under this sword for 70 years and it never falls, right? And another reason is I think they've always understood the logic of the PRC to be that the PRC, they sort of thought they understood was a rational place, and that it just made no sense that a military attack to, as Bridge is calling it, subordinate Taiwan was just crazy, irrational, made no sense for the PRC. And so and on top of that, there is this domestic political stuff around the military in Taiwan, which is a carryover from the authoritarian period and so on. So there's lots of evidence to suggest that the answer is no, right? That Taiwanese are not going to do what they need to do in order to beef up their self-defense. On the other hand, though, I think a lot of those trends are changing. The old guard is completely aged out of the ROC armed forces. And so the younger officer corps and leadership is much more sort of Taiwan focused, understands their mission in a different way. There are still lots of big talkers among the sort of older generation of military people who are more pro-China. I would even say some of them are actually literally pro-China, pro-PRC, but they're not in charge anymore. The other thing that I think we've seen, especially as Bridge points out with the Tsai administration, is a much greater emphasis from the top down in Taiwan on communicating the necessity for a more robust defense. So I have seen more pictures of, I think Tsai Ing-wen has appeared in camouflage and a helmet more than any Taiwanese president since Chiang Kai-shek. She's out there all the time. I got the 10-10 day, the ROC National Day gift pack from friends in the National Security Council in Taiwan. And it was all PPE for COVID protection, but it included a packet of camouflage face masks, which I actually gave to one of my students who's in ROTC. I figured that would match his outfit. But that's very interesting because what that is the Tsai administration messaging to its friends, we are paying attention to military matters in a way that we have not done before. But actually getting Taiwanese people to sign up and to join the military, that's a very tall order. It won't be easy to do. Just if I can add one other point of how the Tsai administration is trying to pull together all of these threads. One of the big stories recently out of the ROC military was the mass wedding, which they always do. They do a big, people in the military get married together in a mass wedding. And this year there were two lesbian couples who also were married. So both the women in each of the couples are military officers and they were marrying civilians. And they put a lot of PR out about this event because what it did was it underscored the fact that young people, young Taiwanese women are joining the military. And by the way, Taiwan is the progressive paradise of same-sex marriage. So, I think they're trying. That's what I would say.
Deepa, you're muted. Do you want me to come in or?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you. If you want to add anything, otherwise I'll go on to the next question.
Yeah. I think Shelley, hit the key points. I think for Taiwan, for many decades, it was irrational for Beijing to contemplate a large-scale assault on Taiwan. Certainly after probably the early 1950s was its last chance after the ROC-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty, but now it's not. It's increasingly not irrational, and certainly if China is only facing Taiwan, it's going to become. I mean, China will have the capability and will have the capability to do it decisively. But I think that's something that's kind of remains speculative probably for most people on Taiwan, and they're not obviously kind of thinking about this, and most normal people aren't. And then of course it's wrapped up with the fact that the traditionally the ROC armed forces were closely tied to the Kuomintang and so forth. So there's that hangover. But I think Shelley put it right. I mean, I think President Tsai deserves credit here for trying to start explaining to people that they really do have skin in the game. I mean, a point I think it's important for people on Taiwan to understand is that for the United States, it's not really a binary decision about whether or not to defend Taiwan. There's also a lot of potential area of discretion in how the United States would go about defending Taiwan. And I think this is important. This is an area where Taiwan's own investments in its own defense will give it more leverage vis-a-vis the United States, and will also mean a U.S. defense approach to Taiwan, as I hope we continue with, that is more, frankly, respectful and respectful is not the right word, that takes into account Taiwan's interests more. So if you think historically during the Cold War, West Germany's great fear was always that a defense of NATO would be fought on West German territory. And one of the ways that the West Germans prevented that from happening was by building up a very capable Bundeswehr. And that gave it a lot of leverage with the United States and others to have a more forward defense. I think for Taiwan going forward, the United States, in my view, should frankly defend Taiwan, whether or not how far Taiwan is willing to go. But how we go about defending Taiwan could be a very different experience for people on Taiwan, to put it a little bit elliptically. And I think from Taiwan's own interest, it's going to have more leverage with the United States if it says, look, we have a high defense capability. We can do more of this offshore. We can do a lot more to bring down Chinese ability to bombard. I mean, just to get into it for a second, I mean, let's take a scenario where the Chinese decide not to invade Taiwan, but decide to use bombardment and blockade. If there is a perception on the part of the United States that Taiwan has been anemic or unsatisfactory or not really pulled its weight on its own defense, the U.S. is going to do a lot less to try to relieve Chinese bombardment of Taiwan. We'll still probably try to help Taiwan defend itself, but it's going to be a lot more difficult on Taiwan because the United States is going to be less inclined to take risk and put our own service members at risk to try to relieve that blockade. So I think it's in Taiwan's best interest on multiple levels, but including in this more this more incremental spectrum to really take the steps needed to help defend itself effectively.
All right, thank you so much for laying out those dilemmas. Well, both of you. And speaking of challenges and threats from China on Taiwan, here's a question that looks kind of at non-traditional. You spoke about the direct military threat, non-traditional security threats that China seems to be inflicting on Taiwan right now. And this is a question from Madeline Hsu. She's a professor at UT Austin. And her question goes to the question of, within the context of cross-strait relations, in the context of cyberspace and other non-traditional attacks, how can Taiwan do more to defend itself in those realms, not just in the military realm that you laid out, Bridge, but in these two? And it's really Bridge or Shelley or both in this case?
Sure. She's talking kind of about cyber threats and these kinds of things. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is about resilience. I mean, so basically it's a combination of denial and resilience, right? That essentially, I mean, cyber is kind of tossed around a lot, but basically there would be some kind of infliction of harm, like an economic loss, or, I mean, people sometimes talk about, shutting off the power grid. Well, if that's going to work, it's going to kill people or result in economic losses. So, first of all, as we're doing with all kinds of cyber threats, a big part of this is just building up your walls a bit higher. They don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be the Great Wall, 1,000 miles long, et cetera. But you want to make it harder for an opponent to be able to bring down your grid, get into your financial information, get into embarrassing political discussions among people in the LY, for instance. And then you want to be more resilient. For instance, if you if a Chinese threat to cut off or blockade food supplies or medical is a good example where we found that we have, we in the United States have vulnerability because China produces a lot of our pharmaceuticals. Okay, well, I don't think we want to be in that position again. Then let's think about, in the US case, it might be more onshoring. In Taiwan's case, it's a more diversified set of options in terms of trade. I think that's very important for Taiwan, because what we don't want is a situation where China could threaten to blockade or impose crippling economic sanctions on Taiwan, and then Taiwan would capitulate. Based on what Shelley has said, that reinforces my sense watching this a bit over the last couple of years, is that I don't think the people on Taiwan, they don't strike me as particularly the kind of rising generations, they don't strike me as interested in capitulating Taiwan. I think one thing we've learned over the last kind of century or so is that actually civilian populations under this kind of stress can actually have quite a bit of resilience, especially when their sort of fundamental independence or freedoms are put at issue. And I would expect Taiwan to behave similarly, but the key there is to not demand too much, is to make sure that there are other options, and that also helps the United States and others that might want to come to Taiwan's aid. I mean, if Taiwan has no stocks of energy supplies, and suddenly it's gone from sort of 100 to 0, that's not a good situation. Whereas if Taiwan says, look, we've got X weeks worth of energy supplies and medical supplies and food supplies, you're going to have more time to assemble a coalition. That eases the problem for people who want to help Taiwan, which makes it more likely they will do so. So I think in this context, as in so many others, the perfect can be the enemy of the good. Basically raising your walls of denial and increasing your resilience, even if it's partial, will contribute to your security.
Thank you. Also, there's, of course, the element of misinformation as well. And so, and the way in which Taiwan is a particular target of misinformation by China. And so, Shelley, let me ask whether you have, if you can add something on that, because Taiwan has actually been quite active in trying to combat that at the forefront of this cyber warfare.
Yeah, I am not a tech expert at all, but I can say something about the sort of context in which they are responding to these threats. And while ironic, it's kind of ironic, I was just saying that Taiwanese do not see the PRC military threat as pressing or immediate as many Americans think they should. But other threats from China, they are very sensitive to. So they immediately, there's like this immune response in Taiwan, and it is not perfect by any means. Like, there are people who are receptive to messages from Beijing and from throughout the PRC for sure. But Taiwan has a kind of immune response to pathogens that come from the PRC that activates very quickly. Like, their memory cells are really powerful. So the first big episode of this that comes to my mind immediately was in 2012, when the Want group tried to expand its media empire beyond the China Times to other media that would have given it actually almost a 50% or maybe a little more than a 50% controlling share of the Taiwanese media. And Taiwanese people went nuts. I mean, they said this PRC affiliated entity, it's a Taiwanese company, but very dependent on its PRC business. And the boss of the company has made pro-unification statements. We cannot allow this company to own any more media in Taiwan than they already do. And it was the first of the big social movements that led ultimately in 2014 to the sunflowers, that ended Ma Ying-jeou's march toward more and more economic agreements with Beijing, culminated in the 2016 Taiwan victory and so on. So same thing happens with social media and the kind of disinformation and misinformation campaigns that where actors in the PRC and also actors within Taiwan have tried to mess with people's minds in Taiwan. It activates this immune response, and a lot of people become very engaged in fighting back. And I think you saw exactly the same phenomenon, but in a more top-down way when COVID, the first inkling that anybody in Taiwan had that there was a disease spreading in Wuhan that was SARS-like and unclear what it was and how it was spreading, that set off the alarm in Taiwan, and they put all their stuff into place, and they have fended off COVID because they did not wait for the WHO to give them permission to decide that this was dangerous. They did not wait for Beijing to admit that it was a problem. They thought it was a problem in December and started activating all of their defenses. So while these things are really hard to fend off, if anybody can do it in a way, Taiwan is the one, because they're so sensitive to threats from the PRC. And I know that sounds like a total contradiction to what I just said, so sorry.
Well, you know what? It sounds to me, from listening to both of you on this, that Taiwanese people will go all out to defend democracy, its democratic government, and the kind of life it has, but that willing to take arms is a slightly more skeptical on that. However, those two are very much connected in my mind, because really, what are you defending? And so let me just say that is one takeaway for me on this, that in fact, that might be the spur for a stronger defensive position. But we have literally 1 minute, and I do want to ask maybe a quick question, because never let a minute go to waste. This question is from Gerrit van der Wees, who you may know. He's a professor at George Mason University. And this question is for Elbridge. Bridge, he asks a specific question about defense, and he asks on military strategy. And the question is, on the myriad of conflict, invasion, or blockade scenarios, what scenario could one envision in which the US, Europe, Japan, Australia would all go beyond simply defending Taiwan or access denial to sufficiently lean on China to force it to accept Taiwan as its friendly neighbor in order to achieve long-term peace and stability? It's a short, easy question for you to answer.
Well, I have a book coming out on this topic so next year, so I think you'll find it of interest. Thanks for great question. I mean, well, I think you'll have different roles. I mean, I think the United States is the critical player in terms of the direct defense of Taiwan from a Chinese attack, but deterring or dissuading China from expanding the conflict, and then also, war termination, persuading Beijing that it's better off accepting a limited defeat rather than continuing or escalating the conflict. That's where those other countries are going to come in. That's where the economic pressure, for instance, that Europe can. I mean, I've been very encouraged by significant signals from a range of European voices in the last year or two that supportive of Taiwan. So I think, the United States really needs to focus, along with Taiwan and potentially one or two other countries, on ensuring that China cannot seize and hold Taiwan. Because if China is able to basically overtake Taiwan and then present a new reality, it's going to be exceptionally difficult to liberate Taiwan. In fact, it may just be a bridge too far. So what's critical for people on Taiwan is to do as much as possible to make themselves sort of indigestible or working alongside the United States to achieve that goal. But then at that point, Beijing doesn't necessarily just have to roll over. So that, I mean, I am, certainly don't think that the United States should plan for regime change or, invading the mainland, obviously absurd ideas like that. So there's going to have to be a way to persuade Beijing that it's better off kind of going back into its corner. And the reality may be that may look a lot like the status quo ante, as was the case in the Korean War. Although I think it's useful to remind people on the mainland that China's intervention in Korea, I think the point is that a Chinese assault against the U.S. defense perimeter can result in significant political changes that weren't contemplated beforehand. As I think you all know, the United States anticipated the loss of Taiwan to the communists at the close of the Civil War and afterwards. And it was really only China's intervention in the Korean War that led the Truman administration to kind of separate the parties effectively. But if China decides to roll the dice on Taiwan, our own position politically on Taiwan could change. Any number of other things could change. So I think there are also abundant reasons for Beijing to be cautious. But obviously we don't want to run that experiment. So thanks.
Thank you so much. I know that there are actually several other questions, and I'm sorry I can't get to those to the audience. Sorry about that. But I think you have to agree, we've had a very invigorating discussion today. And at least for those of us in the morning time zone, it's gotten us off to a kind of a great start. And I want to just thank Shelley and Bridge for allowing the opportunity for all of us to hear your insights. And I hope we'll be able to have you back again, because these issues are not going away. We'll need to keep understanding what is going on. And let me also remind everyone that we do have a event on December 9th looking directly at the elections, 1 month assessment. So I hope you all be back and hope to see you all. And again, a big thanks. And I wish we could give you a big round of applause, but thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Deepa. Thanks, Shelley. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all.